Welcome back. This is Angela Wade, known in these current Middle Ages as Asar the Dalai Mama. And I'm reading chapter 5 of my first novel, Cloak of Obscurity. So, back to Eddie. Bless. I was not surprised to dream of fish that night, since I trundled up to bed with what felt like a whole school of them sloshing around in my belly. In my dreams, I saw Alysoun, clad in a black gown of mourning, wandering along a dark, empty beach. I could hear her weeping. As I watched, she bent down to pick up a stone or a pebble and cast it into the sea with a cry. A ring flashed on her finger. The sand at her feet was littered with dead fish, and each wave cast more up at her feet. The pebble must have washed back up too. I saw her throw it back into the sea at least twice. I woke around mid-morning, far later than I would have liked. I gave myself a very thorough washing, tended the scrapes and bruises on my face and head, shaved, and changed into clean clothes. As I washed Damien's shirt out in my basin, I couldn't help but think of a spell I'd once heard of involving wax, melon seeds, and scraps of a person's garment. It was generally used to help sickly children and invalids gain weight. I imagined how fashionable my cousin's expensive clothes would look if his appetite increased to the point that he grew too fat to squeeze out his front door without greasing the sides. And then I prayed for pardon. The first thing an apprentice wizard is taught is the rule of 3. Any magic one sends out into the world, for good or ill, will eventually return to the caster, 3 times stronger. My waistline was already expanding with alarming speed. Sadie and my love of her cooking were seeing to that. I certainly didn't need any magic assisting the process. I folded Damien's shirt very, very gently and set it aside with a reverent, "God's angels keep you safe and well, far away from me." Looking back now, perhaps I shouldn't have added that last bit. He's terribly vain, isn't he? I wanted to get to work tracking down Malcolm's movements as soon as possible, but Sadie wouldn't let me. First, she got out a basket for Lee and packed it full of breakfast. Then she packed me full of breakfast. Once she was satisfied I truly couldn't eat another bite, she gave me a great crushing hug and told me to deliver it to Lee along with the basket. "Good morning, Master Edward," Lee chirped when I arrived at his cell. "I'm so glad to see you." "Is something wrong?" Again, I thought I caught a flicker of rodent tails disappearing into the walls. I got stuck on a passage I was reading last night, and I was hoping you'd help me get through it." "Is that all?" I asked. "You've been charged with murder, you're languishing in a cell, and you're worried about a page in a book." "Well, it is a page about the end of the world," he said. "Besides, I'm not really sure what languishing means, but I'm pretty sure I'm not it." "You certainly aren't," I said, setting down the hamper. "Here, courtesy of you-know-who." "Oh, I hope you're going to help me with that," Lee said, peeking into the hamper. "I'm not hungry. Dolores came by and got to me already." "Not a chance," I said, settling myself rather heavily beside him in the straw. "Sadie already got to me." I belched by way of emphasis. Lee grinned. "Did she feed you that chowder last night?" I clutched my stomach and groaned dramatically until I felt like the ocean, enormous and packed with fish. I could feel waves crashing inside me every time I moved. I even dreamed about fish, for goodness sake. Lee giggled. "Master Edward, I think you're exaggerating." "You don't believe me." "Huh. I'm telling you, Lee, Sadie kept feeding me, and if I were an ordinary man, I would have burst. Of course, as I am a wizard, I can alter my shape at will, so I just cast a spell on my belly so it could hold all the chowder. Lee was giggling at this, so I continued. I ate and ate until I'd swelled to the size of a small fishing boat. Then I realized I'd gotten too fat to move. It took 9 strong men to carry me to bed, but I was so big they thought I was a boat, and they put me up in dry dock by mistake, where flocks of seagulls circled my gigantic belly all night. I was huge. I was enormous. I weighed over 1,000 pounds, and my gut held more fish than a stall at a dockside market. Sadie was going to sell tickets. See Edward Broadpaunch, the human Leviathan. He was shaking with laughter. Yeah, right. So, what spell did you cast to become so much smaller now? I shrugged. I don't know. I burped a lot. No, but seriously, I really did dream about fish, I added. It was quite odd. I dreamt that Alysoun was walking along a beach covered with dead fish. Ew. And she was crying and throwing rocks into the water. Throwing rocks? Yeah, that's strange. What do you think it means? I laughed. It means I ate too much. No, really, Master Edward. I'm serious, Lee insisted. It could be important. We have a ritual in my clan that when the priest wants to have a vision, he eats a big meal of roasted meat, as much as he can hold, right before he goes to bed. Well, your clan's priest has a good deal going. Bet he's pretty fat, huh? I'm serious, Master Edward. It works. It really does. I considered the possibility. Divination by indigestion? I mused aloud. Well, when I was a little boy, I used to have visions from time to time. That's partly how my folks found out I had magic. I know there are herbs you can drink or smell to improve prophetic visions, and I do tend to dream more vividly after a heavy meal. I suppose it could work in theory. I'm telling you it does, said Lee. Now, you just have to interpret it. Was there anything in the dream that stood out? The fish, maybe? I shook my head. No, that had to be just bellyache. No, I think the important thing was the ring. What ring? Lee asked. I just remembered. I could see her ring in my dream, I said. The ring that's missing. In my dream, she was wearing it. Lee's eyes brightened. Maybe her killer took it. Very possibly, or perhaps it was dropped in a struggle. Either way, I have a strong feeling if we find out what happened to the ring, we'll find out what happened to Alysoun. Our conversation was interrupted by a knock on the cell door. Time's up, wizard, called the jailer. This ain't a tavern. Go make love somewhere else. Before I rose to leave, I gave Lee a big bear hug. That's from Sadie, I explained. The boy was blushing. I'll try and stop by tonight. I got up and went to the door. Wait, Lee called, before you go. Do you have any parchment scraps in your bag, or a lead pencil, or an extra candle? My first one burned out. He knew I did. I gave him what he asked for and lit the candle. Thank you, he said. I'm really bored. I grinned at him. I expect to see you practice your letters when I get back. The first thing I did after leaving the jail was to retrace my drunken wanderings of the night of the murder. I wanted to find the tavern where Malcolm had attacked me the first time. There were 3 main roads leading from the South Gate Bridge towards Sadie's: Lower Water, Upper Water, and Trade Way. I hoped that the tavern was on one of them, and not on one of the dozens of unnamed cross streets, or I could search all day and not find it. On Lower Water, close to the bridge, I caught sight of a sign that looked familiar, a badger sitting on a barrel. I entered the tavern. The noonday crowd was beginning to come in, so I seated myself at the end of the bar and waited for the owner to notice me. After a few minutes, I caught his eye. "What can I bring—" Say, it's you, isn't it?" he said, squinting at my face. "The fellow Malcolm belted the other night." "You know Malcolm?" I asked eagerly. "Of course, he's a regular here. You know, friend, if you don't mind my saying so, your face seems to be getting worse, not better." "I know," I said ruefully. "He took another swing at me yesterday." "You don't say." The garrulous little man chuckled. "What's he got against you? You owe him money?" I didn't feel like giving too much away to the tavern keeper, so I shrugged and said, "I was hoping you could tell me. I hardly know the guy." "Really?" "Really. I bought boots from him once, and the servants in our households know each other. I don't know why he hit me that night. I don't understand it." Tavern keeper nodded agreement. "Yeah, makes no sense. I mean, he's got a temper, sure, but he doesn't go risking his fingers on someone's face without a reason. He's a craftsman, you know." That was an interesting perspective. "Are you sure you don't owe him money?" "Certain." I thought for a moment. "Do folks owe him money all the time?" Tavern keeper laughed. "Sure do. He's one of the best card players I've ever seen." "He plays cards here?" "At least once a week." A deliciously plump serving girl came to speak to her master, but he waved her away. Pity. She made nice scenery. I watched her as she moved away. "And he almost always wins," the man continued. I forced my eyes off the barmaid's waggling rump with some difficulty and returned to the conversation. "He plays for money?" I asked. The tavern keeper snorted. "What else would a man play for? Cheese biscuits?" I laughed. "I suppose you're right," I said, "though I myself never had money to gamble with and only played Sadie and her husband for shortbread. It's good money, too, very good money. I've watched him." The barman leaned closer. "He told me once he was saving up to convince his master to let him marry the daughter of the house. I hear she's dead now? Drowned or something. Say, you don't think he could have had something to do with it?" I shrugged. "You say he was here that night?" The tavern keeper nodded. "It was still daylight when he got here. Hard for him to have done anything then." "Well, when did he leave?" I asked. "Why do you need to know?" I shrugged again. "You do think he drowned her, didn't you?" The man got up to leave. "Not a chance. He loved that girl." I realized to get anything else out of the man, I'd have to convince him I wasn't out to cause trouble for one of his customers. "Listen, friend, I don't think there's anyone who knew him believes he'd have hurt Alysoun, but he needs to be able to prove where he was that night." The tavern keeper squinted at me. "And just who the hell are you to care anyway? And why were you and Malcolm fighting?" "I don't know." "Then maybe I don't know why I should keep talking to you." He turned his back on me, and I knew I'd get nothing more for him. My next stop was the Tanner house in Leather Lane. I needed to know when, or if, Malcolm had returned home that night. Lee had been out all night, but Dolores, the housekeeper, might have let Malcolm in. The shop front was closed. The shutters had been pulled up. The racks of leather wares were all out of sight, and the house appeared deserted. I knocked softly. When I got no answer, I tried the door and found it unlatched. I hesitated, my desire to search the property conflicting with fear of getting caught. After the debacle at the temple, I was thinking twice about butting in where I wasn't wanted. "Hello," I called through the door. "Dolores? Are you home?" "Hello? Who is it?" called a woman's voice from somewhere in the back of the house. "Edward Redmage, Sadie Brewer's friend," I answered. After a brief pause, the voice called, "Come on back." The house was dark with the shutters closed. The racks of leather goods crowded together like misshapen sentinels. The bitter stink of illness still touched the air, and I had to fight a shudder as I passed the stairs, leaving the room where Master Roger had died. I found Dolores sitting in the kitchen, staring out the back door into the garden, shelling a bowl of peas without looking at them. "Dolores?" I said softly. "Mrs. Dolores, are you all right?" Upon hearing my voice, the tiny woman left from her stool, suddenly all smiles. "Oh, Master Edward, it's so good to see you," she cried, beaming. She threw her wiry arms about me in a surprisingly fierce embrace. "Lee's told me how kind you've been," she said, looking up into my face. Now I could see the tears moistening the lines at the corners of her eyes. "That poor child has no one, you know, no family, and his own people won't claim him. You and I are all he has now." She turned away, rubbing her eyes with the corner of her apron. "What about Malcolm?" I asked. "How's he holding up?" Dolores threw her hands in the air. "I don't know what to make of him," she said. "I can't believe he'd ever hurt Alysoun. But he's been acting so strangely. You know, I think he may be the one who set the law on Lee." "Why would he do that?" "I have no idea," she said. "Nothing in this house makes sense anymore. The whole world is falling apart. And I'm forgetting my manners. Here, let me get you something." I tried to tell her I'd already eaten, but she cut me off. "Oh, please, don't be shy. I'm sure you're famished. I could use the company anyway, and I don't know any better than to keep on cooking for the household, and there's no one here." So I sat down to eat with her. "I hate to eat alone," she said, pouring me a mug of beer. "And dear Lee's in prison, and Malcolm... Well, you know this shop belongs to him now, though I don't know how he'll keep it. He's not open since Alysoun left. Well, Malcolm keeps odd hours, and the others..." She paused to rub her eyes again. "I am so happy to have you here to talk to, Master Edward." I wanted to ask her if she knew when Malcolm had come home, St. Michael's Eve, but I couldn't bring myself to interrupt her. She was obviously so lonely, so forlorn, bereft of the only family she'd had for years. She pushed her food around without eating and sighed. "I just don't seem to have any appetite these days," she said, "and I'm so tired. It's just like there's a fog settled over this house, and it's weighing me down. I think everyone feels it. Even Alysoun's duck has gone into mourning." "Alysoun's duck?" Dolores smiled wanly. "Oh, yes, she kept, she corrected herself, a pet duck. She bought a duckling a couple years ago at a fair. She fell in love with this cute little yellow fuzzball, and Master Tanner figured we could use the eggs, so he let her keep it in the fish pool." She laughed. "My, was he disappointed when it turned out to be a drake. He wanted me to cook it, but Alysoun wouldn't allow it. Now that Alysoun's gone, the poor bird's gone into a decline and started molting all over." She shook her head at the injustice of it all. "Oh, but I shouldn't be depressing you this way. Lee tells me you're going to prove he was with the elf folk when it happened." I nodded. "I'm going to the elves' quarter today and ask if anyone remembers seeing him. I don't know if the king's court will listen to elves, but I have to at least try." "Oh, that's wonderful," she said. "We both know Lee couldn't ever have hurt Alysoun." "Of course not," I agreed. "Dolores, I almost hate to ask you this, but do you remember when Malcolm came home the night that Alysoun left?" "Oh, yes," she said. "I'd been sitting up waiting for Alysoun to come home, you know. She'd never been out so late before, and I was worried sick about her." Once more the apron went to her eyes. "It was so late, and I was so tired, and I kept dozing off. After the midnight bell, I started setting the hourglass, just so I could try and keep up with the time. It was less than an hour after the first bell when Malcolm came home. "Are you sure?" I said. "Less than an hour?" I remember hearing first bell after my fight with Malcolm. "Oh, yes," she said, "because I'd waked at the bell and turned the glass over, and it hadn't run out yet when he came in." "Did he say anything to you?" "Well, he was in a terrible temper, and I think he'd been drinking. He didn't answer most of my questions. He did say Alysoun had run off and he hadn't seen her since. He figured she was visiting one of her girl friends. He told me he wanted to be waked up the second she walked in the door. But of course, the poor girl never did," she added. "The funeral is tomorrow, if you'd like to go." "I'll be there," I promised. "And hopefully Lee, and bless him, Malcolm too, will be there. It looks like neither of them were alone that night long enough to have anything to do with what happened to poor Alysoun." "You really think so?" "Oh, yes. And I think if we can find witnesses to testify, then the judges will think so too." Dolores leapt up and hugged me. "That's wonderful, Edward. Are you going to go tell Lee?" "Why don't you go tell him yourself?" I said. "Oh, I've got far much to do here. If he's going to come home, I've got to turn out his bed and wash his clothes." "Oh, all right," I said, smiling at the old woman who had suddenly regained a purpose in life. "I'll tell him, but first I have a witness for him." "Well, of course," said Dolores, "but that should be easy." Dolores was wrong. Though I had ridden through on carts, taking the south road out of Bell Camp, of course, and I had escorted Lyra to her home only a few nights before, I'd never before actually walked in the part of the city known as the Elves' Quarter in daylight. It lay outside the south gate, on the far side of the river. The homes closest to the river were built on pilings over the muddy banks, with the others radiating outward in a haphazard sprawl. The houses were smaller than those inside the city walls, one story rather than two or three, and were made mostly of plaster over plated reeds rather than stone, brick, or wood. Some were even made partially of leather. They were not as tightly packed as houses in the city, though, and small kitchen gardens and animal pens filled the spaces between them. I felt eyes upon me constantly, peering from half-closed windows and doors, though the streets managed to empty at my approach. Those few people I saw and tried to speak to shrugged, as if they couldn't understand my speech, and quickly turned away. I recalled Lee's words. "Trust must be earned, and that isn't easy." I roamed the hostile alleys for an hour or so. No one spoke to me in all that time. On more than one occasion, I saw a mother whisk her children indoors at the sight of me. I was beginning to despair of ever finding anyone willing to vouch for Lee. Finally, as I turned a corner back onto the main road, I saw a solitary figure standing in the middle of the street. She met my gaze as I walked up to her. I knew this was not a chance meeting. She was waiting for me. She was very old, small and thin after the manner of elves, and with her brown face creased with innumerable lines. Her rich iron-gray hair was plaited into dozens of braids and held with elaborate silver pins. Her gown was simply cut, but the collar and cuffs were embroidered with thousands of tiny beads. Her neck and wrists were weighted with heavy pendants and bracelets of enameled silver. Obviously, she was either a person of great wealth and importance or a streetwalker, and I guessed her age prohibited the latter. She spoke before I did. "You are Edward, the one they call the Red Mage." Well, at least she knew my name. That was a start. "Yes, mistress, I am. I'm looking for someone willing to testify in the king's court." She cut me off. I know why you are here. Come, follow me. I was not about to argue with her. She carried herself with such dignity she might as well have been the Archangel Phoebe herself, come down to see how we were treating her herds and flocks. She led me to her home, another plaster and leather dwelling, only slightly larger than those of her neighbors. I followed her in, stooping to get through the doorway. Please, she said, sit down. She indicated one of a pair of polished wooden stools at either side of a small table. I sat, just barely out of arm's reach, well, mine anyway. A young girl was kneeling, tending a pot that hung over a small hearth. Whether she was a servant, a grandchild, or disciple, I couldn't tell. At a gesture and a soft murmur from the old woman, the girl rose, bowed, and left the room through a curtained doorway. The old woman sat down across from me, her gaze unwavering, but said nothing. The girl returned momentarily with a pair of bowls and spoons. After filling them from the pot over the fire, she set them before us, then withdrew as silently as she'd done everything else. The old woman bowed her head over her bowl, saying what must have been a prayer, though the only words I caught were a couple of gods' names Lee had taught me. I bowed my head as well, and softly gave thanks to Saint Cyprian for the produce of the fields. The bowl contained some sort of peas or beans. I didn't dare insult my hostess by telling her I wasn't hungry. The beans weren't bad, rather nut-like actually, but I wondered if they'd been cooked long enough. They were very crunchy. I guess the old elf must have very strong teeth if this was what she ate every day. Of course, it could have been a test for me. Would the stupid stranger actually eat undercooked animal fodder? Remembering the manners my mother had taught me, I left a spoonful in my bowl, enough to assure the old woman that her meal had been satisfying, but not so much as to make her think I hadn't liked it. The bowl had been larger than it had looked, and I hoped I didn't start belching. Now, Edward, the old woman began, laying down her spoon, you may call me Tila. There is nothing that happens to any elf anywhere in your kingdom that I do not know. You wish me to speak to your king's judges and tell them the child we call Wehelia was with us on the night of the solstice. I nodded. Yes, Mistress Tila. Just Tila. Tila. The boy, Wehelia Leia? I hoped I had the name right. Lee had never told me he'd been saddled with such a mouthful. He has been accused of killing the daughter of his late master. If you testify that he was with you, they'll have to let him go. What makes you so sure the child was with us? What? I certainly hadn't expected that. Why do you believe Wehelia was with us? Because he told me so. The old elf's stare intensified. You do not believe the child is capable of murder, do you? What could I say to that? I suddenly felt sick, and it wasn't because of the beans. You think Lee killed Alysoun? I stammered. He wasn't with you that night? I couldn't believe he had lied to me. Are you saying you think he killed Alysoun? I don't believe it. He didn't kill her. It's not in his nature. The faintest hint of a smile touched Tila's lips. Do not fear, Edward. The child was with us that night. I sank back to my stool. I hadn't even realized I'd been standing. I will tell any judge who asks that your friend Lee had no part in the death of that poor girl. You were not lied to. I knew he wouldn't lie to me, I said. Boldly, I continued. If you already knew he was innocent, Tila, why didn't you say so? Were you testing me? I wish to know how you felt about the child, she said. I am curious about what your people think of our Wehelia. Well, why don't you ask him yourself? I snapped. The woman's flat calm irritated me. Why, I wondered, didn't she seem to care about Lee? Even though part of my mind was screaming at me to bite my tongue, I kept blundering on. I realize this is probably none of my business. But why haven't you come out and said anything already? The child's been in prison over a day now. Is he or isn't he a concern of yours? I know he's only half elven, but I'm sure he's not the only one. Why single him out for rejection? You have very strong feelings for the child, she said. Yes, I do, I said, nodding. When I was a boy, I was quiet and thoughtful, much like Lee, and I didn't have many friends. But I had older sisters who looked out for me, stood up for me. Lee doesn't have any family. I have to stand up for him. Tila rose. She stood silently before the hearth for a few minutes, staring at the glowing embers. You asked why your friend Wahelia is an outcast, she said finally. During the last war, Wahelia's mother was raped by one of your soldiers. We have had countless troubles visited on us by your people. Many among us feel we don't need to foster the children of our oppressors.